Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to make a video about high-end swords and try to answer the question, what sword would you buy if money wasn't a problem? And I've been getting that question a lot lately. There's been a lot of new sword friends that have joined the channel, and I have 4 examples here of high-end swords, but I'm going to consolidate the question a little bit, hopefully in a way that's helpful, and that is to say, which katana would I buy in the event money wasn't an issue that was also commercially available. So that means I'm separating out the custom projects where I have to engage with a separate person and go through a series of different craftsmen and eventually come out with an awesome sword. I'm stripping out the one-off eBay lucky finds kind of thing, and I'm sticking to basically commercially available swords where you can go to a company, you can give them your money, and within some reasonable amount of time get a sword that is finished out the other end, hopefully in the state and with the features that you want. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. I have 4 examples, one from Tsuka, one from Motohara Evolution Blades, one from Hanwei, and one from Citadel. There's some names that do belong on this list that I don't have present in, well, I have examples, but not at the same level as these, as in $1,500 plus. Skyjiro and Zisei are both manufacturers I'm aware should probably be here and represented, but I just don't have examples that are kind of at the same threshold, though they do manufacture them. So unfortunately, you'll have to look at my reviews for those. But these are a smattering of relatively high-end swords that are commercially available with a degree. So another slight caveat, the Tsuka SO5 is probably the only one that currently right now is available for you to go buy. The others, though, the example that I'm going to look at, which is an older first-generation LMC from Motohara, isn't necessarily available. The examples today are probably better. But you can go there, and the things I'm going to point out that I like about the sword are represented in other wares that they have. The Hanwei Kami Katana is right here. This is another one that, again, is not sold, but it does represent a lot of the capability that Hanwei is capable of, and a lot of the pros and cons that I could talk about, again, I feel are represented on the products that they make today. And Citadel, this is the Citadel Bamboo. Again, one I don't think you can buy right now, but is theoretically, they make other swords, and this is an example of what you can expect from them. A lot of the pros and cons, having had a few Citadel swords, I think are, again, representative on the other wares that they make. So that's what I can tell you about these swords. They're not necessarily all things you can go off the shelf and buy, but they hopefully give you an idea of what to expect from that manufacturer as you're deciding if it's worth your money or not. The next critical point I can tell you is that these swords, even amongst these 4, have really different customers in mind, almost for each one of them. Some swords in the high end are going to focus on, well, being a closer representation of the historical swords they're trying to emulate. They'll incorporate folded steels and complex lamination techniques and elaborate, time-consuming, human-involved techniques to put the sword together or manufacture it in some way. Others focus on being a really high-end performance tool for a practitioner of Japanese sword arts. And so you'll see kind of a divide. I think there's an assumption very often for folks that either aren't involved in swords generally or are new to swords, katana in particular, where I want a better one, and more money simply means better in every way. And that isn't necessarily the case. A sword, generally speaking, made of complex lamination and folding, there's a lot that can go wrong, and I generally tend to find that in the modern reproduction realm, they tend to be on the softer side. All things being equal, they can be good, but it's harder to make them good in contrast to some of the modern performance steels that are out there. And I think in general, if you compare some of the really, really high-end specialty steels that people use and competent manufacturers that know how to use them, you get a sword that's going to perform better than the more complex laminated tools. It doesn't make them less beautiful or not worth it or bad swords, but if you're looking for a pure performance-based tool, modern homogeneous steels tend to be the way those manufacturers go. If you're looking for an artistic object, folding and something more elaborate and beautiful in the surface of the steel is usually desired, and manufacturers make something totally different. Anyway, they are different things. They're made for different customers. You kind of have to pick where you want to go. Unfortunately, there's not one that does it all. There's not one that incorporates all of the tradition and beauty that you would typically see in a Japanese-style sword, an antique, for example, but also has all of the high-end performance characteristics of modern homogeneous steels available today. There isn't something that is currently made today that I think does all those things. but there are some damn good swords, and hopefully you find this interesting. So I'm going to go over each sword individually, call out its pros and cons, and there's 3 categories that I would say I'm going to touch on the most, and maybe some subcategories that relate to them, because I'm pretty chatty. One is the fittings themselves. So as I talk about that, if I look at this sword right here, I'm talking about the Tsuba, the Kashira, the Fuchi, the Minuki, those fittings, how they're made, what materials they're made from. That's one category, is the furniture itself, those individual pieces. The next is how it's assembled into a sword, and the little nuances about if it's good or bad. So when I say that, like, are there transitions that are not where they should be, that might snag on your hand, things that might bite your fingers? Does it draw from the saya well and sheath well? Is it quiet? Does it rattle? Is the ito tight? Little nuances like that that show attention to small detail and can be a boon when you're using it to study Japanese swordsmanship, or just something you might be looking for if you like well-made things. The other is the blade, and so there's blades with folded steel that I have here and blades without. They're both represented here, and I can talk about the steel, the construction, and what the benefits of them are. So those are the things that I'm going to go over individually, and I'll talk briefly. I haven't reviewed all of these swords yet, but I've done at least 3 of them, and one will eventually come out. I haven't fully reviewed it yet, but the point is that if you're looking for more detail and to hear me blab for the better part of an hour on any one of them, that should be available to you depending on when you watch this video. Alright, starting with the least expensive one, this is the Hanwei Kami Katana. It's $1,500. Unfortunately, you can't buy it anymore, but Hanwei still makes higher end options. And there's some things to call out here right away. One, it is the least expensive, and probably one of the more feature-rich swords that are on the table here, but it also has, debatably, some of the most cons. So we'll go over it. Fuchi Kashira, if I look at the fittings on here, one thing Hanwei does particularly well in any of their swords, low to high end, is the casting quality. Now these are cast pieces, meaning that they're poured into a mold. I believe these are bronze casting as opposed to alloy or steel or iron, but they are cast. They incorporate subtle little gold and silver details, which in Hanwei seem to be tastefully applied more so than I see from other manufacturers. So the quality of the fittings on this itself, they're cast. They, from a distance do, emulate some of the traditional Japanese style metalwork that you would see on furniture and details. They can be elaborate and reasonably tastefully done, particularly from the Hanwei brand. So that's the quality of the fittings themselves, I think, are nice. And this one seems to have extra little details. There's kurigata out of metal, a kojiri down here, and a koiguchi made of metal up at the top. Now, how it's assembled is a little bit different. There's some rattle on this one, which is pretty common on Hanwei swords. They aren't often necessarily quiet. It's in both directions if I kind of shake it around. The ito is on the looser side. It's not comically loose or terrible. It's not going to fall apart soon, but I can move it. I can displace it. So when I talk about high-end swords, what's the expectation? If I take my finger and press on one of these little knots, that it doesn't move at all, and that I can push really, really, really hard to the point of discomfort, and then maybe feel a little bit of movement. But basically I should be able to really push on this with a good amount of force and not have any movement whatsoever. Some is okay, and some can hold up for a while. But loose ito, the looser it is, the more quickly it degrades, and you have to have your handle rewrapped or it starts coming undone while you're using the sword, and that's not ideal. So we want this to be really tight. We want the diamonds to be basically consistent in shape and basically consistent in the way they line up down, so the corners should all kind of line up with one another. That isn't happening here. There's not any terrible transitions on this one, but the diamonds wander, the ito isn't particularly tight, and it's not particularly quiet. It rattles. It feels like these parts are all made separately and then assembled on one blade. That's common in the mass production market. Just disappointing to see, even when you get to this price point, that's kind of how they're made. Now this blade does have a ton of details on it. It's a folded blade, so it has a lovely looking surface to the steel. You can see a lot of little details in the folding. It doesn't incorporate any complex lamination techniques, but it is differentially hardened. It has a hamon and a polish style that makes it easy to see in just about any light. There's a nice bohi that runs down the blade. Is terminated in roughly the same spot, but The polish is murky. It's you can make out details, but it's certainly something kind of unique to Hanwei, and clearly an emulation of a Japanese style polish, and not done traditionally. The Kasaki doesn't have the same kind of polishing technique that you would hope for this kind of larger O Kasaki on here, but it does still make a handsome sword. I'm not arguing. I like this sword. I think it's pretty. At the same time, it could be better. The polish could be cleaner. The Kasaki in particular could be better. The bohi could be better terminated. This one does incorporate a horimono, and this is I can't remember what it is. It's like the Fire Guardian or something. But it's hand engraved. You can kind of see that there's a power tool involved in doing it rather than chiseling it out by hand. That tool marking is present in there. But for a mass production sword, having horimono on it that isn't just simply etched in and is at least done by hand is something unique and rather special. Not something Hanwei does on a lot of their swords. I think this might be the only one. There may be some others. I think there's one from Dragon King, which has some association with Hanwei, if I understand correctly, that incorporates horimono as well. But that is something special. So blade features here are kind of the kicker. This has a really bright red scabbard. It looks great as wall art. If you look at it close, it has fittings that kind of emulate the Japanese style. It has a very bold, easy to see polish. It's got a ton of features on it for $1,500, but at the same time, even at $1,500, there's some problems, some looseness, some scuffs in the polish, some things that certainly could be better. So one thing you're going to find throughout these swords is that there isn't one that's perfect either. Regardless of how much money you spend, there's always going to be little things, particularly if you're picky like me, that you'll be able to pick apart. The next one that I'll show you is the Citadel. And this one I believe was $2,800, so we're going to jump around in price a little bit. I'm not doing it from least to highest, but this is a bit of a jump, so $2,800, and what do you get? Well, here, from a practitioner standpoint, the diamonds are consistent in shape, and they don't move around. I really have to press pretty hard to get them to displace at all. The fittings have great transitions, and overall it feels really good in the hand. They are also handmade, and so by contrast, where the Hanwei has cast fittings, so things that are poured into a mold and are more elaborate, they're still, basically molded pieces, and having pieces that are made by hand, where somebody has to shape them by hand and weld them and patina them. A tsuba that, albeit more simple, is done traditionally. Somebody with basically a little chisel, a metal chisel, is sitting here working on it. I imagine there's some element of power tools involved, but to get the shape, to get the look, it's done by human hands. That takes a lot more time, and you find the $2,800 is commensurate with the work that's done here in terms of human effort. Other things that you see, there's a Samegawa raiskin wrapped around the scabbard. It's done very nice. The transitions and finish are all really quite good, and from a practitioner standpoint, this is a very enjoyable sword to use. But again, not without flaws. One, the saya has shrunk a little over time, particularly since I've finished my review on it. It always had a little bit of a snag, but now it's become rather tight. It started with a little bit of tightness, but over time, depending on the weather, this really starts to hold in and bind the sword towards the Kasaki area. It's also chipped in the koi guchi area up here. The mouth of the sai has had a slight chip in it, probably from shrinking around the blade while it's been in it. So, not perfect. It didn't, just sitting there, it developed some sort of condition issue that I'm sure if I trained with this a lot and draw and sheath and whatnot, that it would be okay, but binding down here is also going to diminish the polish on the sword and likely start to create some wear around the tip where it's binding. It's going to rub on there and diminish the polish a little bit. The other thing to note about this sword for $2,800 is there's no horimono and there's no folding either. It's a differentially hardened blade, and while the Hanwei had a very bold polish that made the differential hardening easy to see, this one has a very subtle polish, and it could be done better. There's a lot of characteristic happening in the steel that I can't see because of a very rudimentary polish. So again, $2,800, not quite twice the price, but close. And there's still some oddness here. Also, Citadel has noted that this profile on the Kasaki is a historic one, but it's something I've really only seen on their swords. I haven't seen another tip quite like this, so they have some, again, things that are somewhat unique and identify them as manufactured by Citadel. I will say, in contrast to other swords, this Citadel up until I got the Motohara, which is the one I'll talk about next, this was my favorite training sword. It's sharp and fantastic and moves around well, and really the saya binding is about the only complaint. But it's not terribly feature-rich for $2,800. Still an excellent sword. Why is it $2,800? Well, there's a lot of handwork that goes into it, but it's also a 1075 mono steel, and it's not it's differentially hardened, but it's not folded steel. There's not a pattern on it. It's a mixture between something that's like well-made, but a little bit more geared toward a practitioner. The next one I'll talk about is the Motohara LMC. So Motohara makes a few of them. This is a first generation. I think most of the items that you would find from Motohara or Evolution Blades are probably going to be higher end than this or nicer. But this was around $1,500 to $2,000 at the time. I think they might be up a little bit more, but likely so is the quality. On this first generation one though, the Ito, rock solid. It doesn't move around, super tight. Shaping could be, in my personal opinion, a little better, though this is perfectly suitable and well shaped and not bad. I just happen to like a little bit of a swept shape, which I have on other models of the from Evolution Blades, so they can make more shapely handles if you're interested in that. But transitions, all of the things in terms of how it fits together are excellent to use as a practitioner. It's quiet, it after years is still drawing and sheathing well. Things taper the way they're supposed to. They're all made of quality materials, but these are just very simple cast fittings with a simple cutout tsuba. So at $2,000, there aren't any precious metals here. The casting quality is okay, but very akin to what you would find on an iaido. Not particularly bespoke to Evolution Blades, and just generally pretty simple. They're not bad by any means, but they're also not special. And when you're spending this kind of money, something special that isn't either A, just cast, or is at least only cast for your products and is somewhat a unique identifier, I think is something I appreciate. Not something that's necessarily expected, because the other redeeming qualities about this sword are really the steel that's used in the performance characteristics. So this is a modern homogeneous steel. It doesn't have a hara or a pattern. It does have a hamon that is handsome and very present and easy to see. The polish work on these is usually pretty good. This one, though, has a geometry that is, purpose-built to be a grass cutter. So if you are somebody who's studying a style of Japanese swordsmanship that focuses on doing tamashigiri and cutting arts, then this is a light blade that is wide and just purpose-built to be a light, lively, but very effective cutter. It's one of the few swords that has been an excellent cutter for tamashigiri and an excellent sword to use for iaido. And it's rare that I like a sword to do two things at the same time, and this one happens to do that. It's very effective at both of those tasks. I train with it quite a lot. I tend to prefer the Tensho, because if I'm doing EI, which is frankly what I do most of the time given the price of tatami mats, this one without a bohi isn't very loud. It's tougher for me to hear if I'm doing the techniques correctly. But as a lightweight tool, I can move it. My arm is a little bit sore right now, and I can still move it around. It's effortless to move around. But as a practitioner's tool, it's absolutely excellent. And frankly, if you're asking me which sword would I buy, well, it's a little bit of a spoiler, but this one. If I think of the swords that come and go through my collection, this is one that has stayed and will likely continue to, because it's an absolutely excellent training tool. And that's one of the things I need. I need an excellent training tool. I studied two different styles of swordsmanship. I focus a lot on iaido. I do tamashigiri as well. And having a tool that can do both is absolutely fantastic. It's my size. It's comfortable to use. I didn't realize how much I would enjoy having it, but having since had a long-winded case of tennis elbow, having something light has allowed me to practice while still having some semblance of recovery. So I tend to lean towards tools that are good and help me learn and don't fight me while I'm trying to learn something and allow me to get the most out of my extracurricular activities. But that doesn't mean I don't have an appreciation for artistic swords. And this one from Taisuki is an example of that. So this is the SO5. There's not a review out on this yet, but eventually will be, depending on when you watch this video. It may or may not be there. I'll try to link it in the description when it becomes available if you're interested. But this one, if I talk about fittings first, well, one thing is it incorporates real silver. So unlike the other fittings here, one of them has handmade iron fittings, but this one is actually just real silver, but they're cast. So they're not doing intricate metal work. They're casting the fittings, but out of a precious material. There are some casting issues as well, so some of them aren't as clean as I think they could be, but they are made nonetheless out of a precious material. The Ito I think out of the four here, moves around the most. Now when I got this, it moved around a little bit more than it does now. It's tightened up a little bit with the, maybe the cold, dry weather has shrunk things a little bit, and so it feels a little bit tighter than it did before, but there are certainly some spots where I can move it more than I would say is acceptable. So even at $3,000, this is the most expensive sword on the table here. The Ito can move around. Just because you're spending a lot of money on a sword doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be perfect. And this is one example of something that I think Skydro, or not Skydro, I keep calling it Skydro, one thing that I think Taisuki should address is making these a little bit tighter. This one is a little bit rounder handle, not in a way that's uncomfortable. It's well painted, but the Sageo was tied on a little sooner, and it's left a few marks. The Sageo, incidentally, is the nicest. It looks kind of like it blends in with just about any other Sageo, but it's softer, it's a different pattern, and it feels different and more refined in my hand, so it's a nicer bit there. It doesn't rattle, it draws well, it has right amount of tension, it's quiet as it goes in and out. From a practitioner standpoint, I think that's good, and it's held up well, but the blade is a little bit more cumbersome and hefty, not necessarily in a bad way, though I haven't spent enough time with it to really critique. I certainly do feel it while doing EI with it, because I have trained with it a few times. It's not one that's going to be gingerly to move around. Haven't cut with it yet, though. It does have a really bold pattern in terms of the hamon that's on here, as well as the hara, but the polish work on it for the money is not necessarily fantastic. There's a lot of little scratch marks in here, and so if you're looking for a sword that is $3,000 and expecting perfection, well, it's not necessarily going to be this one. In fairness, though, the polish is hard to do. Most vendors don't do it right. The only one that I've really seen do polish in a way that's better or kind of on par with some of the custom work I have done is Issei, and to a lesser extent Dragon Sword. But pretty rarely do vendors invest a lot of time in the polish, and that's a shame. This one in particular is really, I think, geared towards emulating a higher end, or at least an antique style sword, or being a little bit more in line with the features of a traditional Japanese sword. I like the precious metals, but the polish here I think is a miss. In fairness, though, if I were to have this polished, it would cost me well over $1,000 to send this to somebody to have them polish and do this differently. So do bear in mind that the amount of labor necessary to do a polish well is substantial, and so it doesn't surprise me that there's, it's not always as perfect as you'd like. But anyway, this is another sword at $3,000 that at least falls in line with the higher end swords. So looking at these things and examining some of the factors, I don't know that I have the best answer for you, but what I can tell you I favor, and which swords I keep on the higher end side of things when money is an issue, I focus on training tools. So if I'm keeping a sword and I'm going out to buy one, I'm looking for one that's going to enhance the experiences that I'm after. Now, Evolution Blades, I think they could certainly stand to make their items a little bit more unique, bespoke, take a few more risks in terms of fittings, and do some things that are maybe visually a little bit more interesting. At the same time, I think they make handsome swords. This is not an ugly thing to my eye. At the same time, it blends in, at least from a distance, with some of its lessers. And where it stands out is really in performance. As a tool, it's worth every penny. I've enjoyed it while I've trained with it. And I would certainly say, if you're going to study Japanese-style swordsmanship, that these are things to be aware of, and Evolution Blades is an excellent manufacturer for them as tools. They hold up well, they hold an edge longer, they're more resilient to my noviceness when I go to whack a tatami mat and do it poorly, bend very easily, and basically it allows me to focus on the technique rather than fighting the tool. At the same time, it's not to say I don't enjoy using any of these swords. I've practiced with all of them, but I certainly enjoy using the Evolution Blades more, and if I'm really trying to improve or focus on doing my technique correctly, I'll grab usually one of my Evolution Blades to do that, or the Moto-hara, same synonymous, Evolution Blades Moto. I think Evolution Blades is the company, Moto-hara is the series of swords, and they range. I think $2,000 is probably the low end now, and you can spend $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 if you want every custom option under the sun there. So anyway, those are the ones that I choose. At the same time, it's not that I don't appreciate other ones, or that I would chagrin you for appreciating them or making a different choice. There are different things that different people like in these swords. My personal focus, though, if you're asking me, which is generally the question, I focus on tools. Hopefully a little tour of some of the other examples out there explains why and helps you make up your mind on where you stand. That's all I got, though. Cheers, and thanks for watching.